The only thing faster than a gasser down the quarter mile was how quickly they vanished from the face of the earth. One minute, they were the kings of the strip, the absolute rock stars of American motorsport, and the next, they were obsolete relics gathering dust in barns. But here's the thing. They didn't die because they were slow. They died because they were too good. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about vintage American muscle and the forgotten mechanical monsters of the past. If you're someone who loves high horsepower history, raw mechanical engineering, and stories about cars that actively try to kill their drivers, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Picture the scene. It's a humid Saturday night in 1964. You're at Lyons Drag Strip in Long Beach. The air smells like burnt rubber and unburnt hydrocarbons. In the left lane, there's a 41 Willys Coupe, but it doesn't look like any Willys that rolled off the assembly line in Toledo. The front axle is a straight beam from a Ford truck, and it's sitting on leaf springs that jack the nose of the car up so high the grille is pointing at the sky. The rear fenders are cut out to clear massive wrinkle wall slicks, and sticking out of the hood isn't just an air cleaner. It's a GMC 671 supercharger roughly the size of a microwave, whining like a banshee even at idle. This thing isn't a car, it's a weapon. It's shaking, it's loud, and it looks like a cartoon drawn by a madman. When the tree drops to green, that Willys doesn't just accelerate, it leaps. The front wheels hang in the air for the first 60 feet, the driver steering with the throttle, fighting physics with raw torque. This was the gasser. And for a glorious, chaotic 20-year window, it was the greatest show on asphalt. Now you might be thinking, why on earth would anyone build a car like that? Why take a perfectly aerodynamic shape and turn it into a brick? Why jack up the center of gravity when every racing textbook tells you to lower it? Look, to understand the gasser, you have to understand the specific problem these guys were trying to solve. In the 1950s and early 1960s, tire technology was frankly garbage. We didn't have the sticky compounds we have today. If you had 500 horsepower, your biggest enemy wasn't wind resistance, it was traction. You could have the most powerful engine in the world, but if you just spun the tires for the first 300 feet, you were gonna lose to a guy with half the power who could actually hook up. This is where the genius of the gasser comes. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to push a heavy refrigerator across a linoleum floor. If you push from the bottom, it slides. If you push from the top, it wants to tip over, right? That tipping force drives the back legs into the floor. That is exactly what gasser builders were doing. By raising the front end and the engine, raising the center of gravity, they were using the car's own inertia to transfer weight violently to the rear tires the moment they hit the gas. It was basic Newtonian physics weaponized for the quarter mile. They weren't fighting the laws of physics, they were exploiting a loophole in them. But let's back up a second. Most people don't realize that the gasser wars weren't just about speed. They were a cultural phenomenon. In the post-war era, you had thousands of GIs coming home with mechanical skills learned keeping P-51 Mustangs and B-17s in the air. They knew superchargers, they knew fuel delivery, and they had access to cheap surplus parts. The NHRA, the National Hot Rod Association, created the gas coupe and sedan class in the early 50s basically to give these guys a sandbox. The rules were deceptively simple. It had to be a coupe or sedan, it had to have fenders, lights, and a starter, and it had to run on pump gas, hence gasser. No exotic nitromethane fuels allowed. What happened next was an arms race that makes the Cold War look like a friendly disagreement. You had teams like Stonewoods and Cook, Big John Mazmanian, and K.S. Pittman. These weren't just racers, they were celebrities. Their cars had names: Swindler II, The Troublemaker, The Football. They toured the country match racing each other, and crowds would go absolutely feral. We're talking about attendance numbers that rivaled Major League Baseball games. Why? Because the cars were relatable. Unlike a dragster, which looked like a pipe rack on wheels, a gasser looked like your dad's old car, if your dad was a psychopath. You could recognize the headlights, you could see the door handles. It maintained this tenuous connection to the street that made the speed feel more real, more dangerous. And dangerous it was. These cars were short-wheelbase, high center of gravity machines doing 130, 140, eventually 150 miles per hour on suspension technology that was barely adequate for a farm truck. When a gasser got out of shape, it didn't just slide. It tumbled. It barrel rolled. The short wheelbase meant they were twitchy. A tiny correction at the steering wheel at 100 miles per hour could send the car darting into the other lane or the guardrail. Drivers spoke about driving through the shaking. They'd keep their foot planted even when the car was vibrating so hard their vision blurred, just trusting that the machine would hold together for another 3 seconds. It was a test of nerve as much as machine. Let's talk specs for a minute, because the numbers from this era are genuinely shocking. In the early days, guys were running Oldsmobile Rockets and Cadillac V8s because that's where the torque was. But by the mid-60s, the Chrysler Hemi and the big block Chevy took over. We are talking about engines displacing 454, 468, sometimes over 500 cubic inches. Naturally aspirated at first, but then came the blowers. A blown 392 Hemi in a chassis that weighed 2,400 pounds is a power-to-weight ratio that rivals a modern Bugatti Chiron. But the Chiron has traction control, stability management, and aerodynamics designed by a supercomputer. The gasser had a straight axle from a 1938 Ford and a driver named Bones wearing a t-shirt and an open-face helmet. Here's what most people don't realize about the A-gas class. It was a premier category. The A designated the weight to cubic inch ratio. To run an A-gas, you needed a light car and a massive engine. This is why the 1933 to 1941 Willys became the holy grail. The Willys was cheap, it was light, and it had a short wheelbase. It was an economy car nobody wanted in the 30s, which meant junkyards were full of them in the 50s. You could pick up a Willys body for $50. Today, try $50,000 for a rusted shell. The demand for these specific bodies became so intense that by 1965, companies started manufacturing fiberglass replicas because the supply of original steel bodies had literally dried up. They had hunted the Willys to near extinction. But the innovation wasn't just in the bodies, it was in the transmissions. You'd assume these manly race cars used manual gearboxes, right? 4-speeds? Actually, a lot of the top gassers ran the B&M Hydrostick. This was a modified 4-speed automatic transmission originally designed for General Motors luxury cars. Why? Consistency. In drag racing, if you miss a shift, you lose. If you break an axle because you dumped the clutch too hard, you lose. The Hydrostick allowed for brutal, consistent launches without shocking the drivetrain as violently as a clutch dump. It was one of the first times we saw automatic transmissions being taken seriously in high-level motorsport, proving that these primitive racers were actually thinking way ahead of the curve. Now look, as we moved into the late 60s, something shifted. The cars started getting faster, much faster. And the very thing that made them work, that high center of gravity, that short wheelbase, started to become their liability. Aerodynamics, which gasser builders had largely ignored or actively fought against, started to matter. At 100 miles per hour, a brick is fine. At 150 miles per hour, air becomes a solid wall. The gassers were hitting an aerodynamic wall, and the solution the industry found wasn't to fix the gasser, it was to replace it entirely. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the fall, there was the peak, the moment where the gasser was untouchable. Here's the thing. Success in racing is a double-edged sword. When you dominate, you attract attention. And when you attract attention, you attract money. By 1964, the big three in Detroit, Ford, Chrysler, and GM, were watching the drag strips closely. They saw thousands of young potential car buyers screaming their lungs out every weekend. But there was a problem. Those kids were cheering for 1941 Willys Coupes and 1948 Anglias. Ford didn't sell Willys Coupes. Chrysler didn't sell Anglias. They wanted to sell Mustangs, Plymouths, and Dodges. They needed a way to hijack that excitement and attach it to cars you could actually buy in a showroom on Monday morning. This is where it gets really interesting and where the seeds of the gasser's destruction were sown. It started with a class called Factory Experimental, or AFX.
The idea was to take a modern car, say a 1965 Dodge Coronet or a Plymouth Belvedere, and modify it for drag racing while keeping it looking somewhat stock. But engineers are never satisfied with somewhat. They realized that the gasser guys were right about weight transfer, but they were wrong about how to achieve it. See, the gasser method was to jack the car up to the moon to transfer weight. But the Chrysler engineers looked at the physics and said, wait a minute, instead of raising the car, why don't we just move the wheels? If you move the rear axle forward and the front axle forward, you fundamentally change the leverage of the chassis without making the car aerodynamically unstable. So they started hacking up these brand new factory cars. They moved the rear wheels forward by 10, 15 inches. They moved the front wheels forward to stretch the wheelbase. The result was a car that looked, well, wrong. It looked distorted. It looked like a caricature of a car. When the first altered wheelbase Dodges rolled out of the trailers in 1965, the announcers and the fans didn't know what to make of them. Someone looked at the bizarre proportions and said, that car looks funny. And just like that, the funny car was born. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so they looked weird. Why did that kill the gasser? Because they worked. They worked too well. These altered wheelbase cars launched just as hard as the gassers, but they were lower, more aerodynamic, and critically, they were faster at the top end. Suddenly, the gasser, with its nose in the air, catching air like a parachute, looked antiquated. It looked like old tech. And in racing, old is a death sentence. The factories poured millions into this. This wasn't Stone Woods and Cook building a car in a garage anymore. This was Chrysler Corporation sending acid-dipped body shells to race teams. Acid dipping is exactly what it sounds like. They would dip the steel body of a car into a vat of acid to eat away metal and make it paper thin to save weight. It was dangerous, expensive, and totally inaccessible to the average guy. But it produced cars that were light, rigid, and brutally fast. The grassroots spirit was starting to suffocate under the weight of corporate cash. Look at the timeline. In 1965, the gassers were the headliners. By 1966, the funny cars, now evolving into full tube chassis monsters with flip-top fiberglass bodies, were stealing the thunder. The crowd started to shift. The kids who used to love the 41 Willys now wanted to see the Snake and the Mongoose in their Plymouths and Hot Wheels-sponsored machines. The visual spectacle of the funny car with its long burnout and flip-top body was fresh. The gasser, for all its wheel-standing glory, was becoming a nostalgia act while it was still technically current. But it wasn't just the competition that was killing them. The gassers were actively trying to kill themselves. As engine technology exploded in the late 60s, horsepower figures were climbing into the 800-900 range. Putting 900 horsepower into a short wheelbase car with a high center of gravity is like trying to balance a broomstick on your palm while riding a unicycle during an earthquake. It's possible, but the margin for error is zero. The crashes became horrific. We aren't talking about fender benders. We're talking about cars going airborne at 140 miles per hour. Because the front end was so high, if a gasser got even a little bit sideways, air would get under the car and lift it. Once the front tires are off the ground at speed, you are just a passenger in a chaotic physics experiment. Insurance companies started to panic. Track owners started to sweat. The liability of running these sky-high cars was becoming a nightmare. The NHRA, always conscious of its image and its insurance premiums, started tightening the screws. Here's what most people don't realize about the death of a racing class. It rarely happens with a single announcement. It's a slow strangulation by the rulebook. The NHRA didn't ban gassers outright immediately, they just made it harder to be one. They started imposing stricter safety rules that ruined the performance advantage. They merged classes. They messed with the weight breaks. They essentially legislated the fun out of the class in the name of safety and modernization. And then there was the 1967 season. This was the turning point, where the writing wasn't just on the wall, it was being screamed over the PA system. The supercharged gas coupes were now running low 9-second passes. They were flirting with 150, 160 miles per hour. At those speeds, the straight axle front suspension, which was basically 1930s technology, was terrifyingly unstable. You had drivers reporting that the cars would hunt all over the track, darting left and right. The solution would have been to lower the car and put on independent suspension. But if you did that, you didn't have a gasser anymore. You had a pro stock car or a generic bracket racer. The gasser's identity was tied to its flaws. If you fixed the flaws, you killed the soul of the car. It's a tragic irony, really. The very things that made the gasser iconic, the nose-high stance, the straight axle, the wild handling, were the exact things that made it unable to survive the pursuit of speed. They had reached the absolute limit of what that chassis design could do. You can't cheat physics forever. Eventually, the air wins. Eventually, the center of gravity wins. By 1968, even the legends were jumping ship. Stone, Woods, and Cook, the most famous gasser team in history, saw the writing on the wall. They parked the swindler Willys and built a Mustang funny car. Think about how heartbreaking that must have been for the die-hard fans. It's like watching your favorite rock band trade in their guitars for synthesizers because that's what's on the radio. When the heroes of the sport abandoned the class, it signaled to everyone else that the era was over. The gasser was no longer the cutting edge. It was a stepping stone that the sport had stepped over. But here is where it gets emotional. The gasser didn't just represent a type of car, it represented a type of racer. The guy who worked the 9 to 5, came home, drank a beer, and welded a subframe in his driveway. The funny car era brought in the age of the specialist. You needed a chassis builder, you needed an engine builder, you needed a body guy, you needed sponsors. The little guy was getting priced out of the sport he helped build. The death of the gasser was the death of the amateur professional. It was the moment drag racing went corporate. Yet, despite the invasion of the funny car and the factory money, the gasser didn't go down without a fight. There were holdouts. There were guys who refused to cut up their Willys or switch to a plastic Mustang. They kept showing up, kept dragging the bumpers, kept terrifying the track officials. But the NHRA had made its decision. The future was low, sleek, and corporate. The gasser was high, wild, and unruly. And in the world of professional motorsport, unruly is a liability. So we enter the 1970s. The muscle car era is peaking and about to crash. The oil crisis is looming on the horizon, and the gasser is sitting there like a dinosaur watching the meteor come down. But the final blow, the absolute nail in the coffin, wasn't the funny car and it wasn't the crashes. It was a rule change so bureaucratic and boring that most people missed it, but it completely erased the gasser from existence. Look, the year was 1972. Nixon was in the White House, The Godfather was in theaters, and the NHRA decided it was time to clean house. For 20 years, the gas classes, A gas, B gas, and so on, had been a staple of the sport. But on the organizational charts, they were becoming a headache. There were too many classes, too many rules, and too many cars that didn't fit the new TV-friendly image drag racing was trying to cultivate. So, with the stroke of a pen, the NHRA dissolved the separate gas classes. They lumped them into a giant catch-all category called Competition Eliminator. Now, you might be thinking, so what? It's just a name change. No, it was an execution. In Competition Eliminator, gassers were forced to race against dragsters, altereds, and other purpose-built race cars that were lighter, more aerodynamic, and fundamentally faster. It was a massacre. Imagine putting a heavyweight boxer in the ring with a guy holding a baseball bat. The gasser, with its high center of gravity and barn door aerodynamics, didn't stand a chance against the sleek, purpose-built econo dragsters and altereds. The competitive advantage was gone. Overnight, a car that had been a championship contender became nothing more than a field filler. This is where the story gets depressing for a minute. What do you do with a race car that can no longer win? You can't drive it on the street. It has 12-to-1 compression and a solid axle. You can't sell it to another racer. They know it's obsolete. So these magnificent machines, these 1941 Willys and 1955 Chevys that were once the kings of the quarter mile were stripped for parts. The engines were pulled out and sold to bracket racers, the transmissions were pawned, and the bodies were often pushed into the corner of the shop, covered with a tarp, or worse, dragged out to a field to rot. We are talking about pieces of history, literal icons of American culture, being treated like scrap metal because a rule book changed. But then something weird happened. The gasser look didn't die. It mutated. In the mid to late 70s, the street freak era was born. You had kids in high school seeing old photos of Stone, Woods, and Cook and thinking, that looks cool. So they started jacking up the front ends of their street cars. They put straight axles on Camaros, Novas, even station wagons. But they missed the point. The original gassers were jacked up for weight transfer. These street freaks were jacked up for style. Most of them were slow, handled like garbage scows, and were dangerous for all the wrong reasons. It became a caricature. The gasser went from being a feared race car to a fashion statement, and often a bad one. It was like wearing a football helmet to the grocery store. You look ready for action, but everyone knows you're just posing. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the gasser was essentially a joke. The trend in hot rodding shifted to Pro Street, cars that were tubbed, lowered, and slammed to the ground. The pastel-colored billet aluminum aesthetic of the 90s had no room for a greasy, high-riding, dangerous 1940s coupe. If you showed up to a car show in 1992 with a straight-axle Willys, people looked at you like you hadn't checked the calendar in 20 years. The cars were seen as crude, unsophisticated, and ugly. It was the dark ages for the straight-axle faithful. However, here's what most people don't realize about nostalgia. It moves in cycles. As drag racing became more professional, more corporate, and more sanitized, something was lost. Modern drag racing is impressive, sure. A top-fuel dragster hitting 330 miles per hour is a feat of engineering, but it's sterile. You can't relate to it. The cars all look the same. The drivers are corporate spokespeople. You can't see the engine. You can't see the suspension working. It's over in 3 seconds. It's clinical. By the early 2000s, a new generation of gearheads started looking back at the old magazines and realized, wait a minute, those guys were insane, and it was awesome. People started getting bored with the perfection of modern cars. They missed the chaos. They missed the danger. They missed the mechanical visibility of the gasser. You could see the headers glowing. You could see the front suspension compressing and rebounding. You could see the driver fighting the steering wheel. It was visceral. This sparked the revival that nobody saw coming. The nostalgia gasser movement began to gain traction. But this wasn't just old guys dusting off their old cars. This was young builders, guys in their 20s and 30s finding rusted hulks in fields and rebuilding them to 1965 specs. And I mean exact specs. We aren't talking about putting a modern LS engine in an old Willys. We are talking about hunting down vintage 392 Hemis, finding original Hillborn mechanical fuel injection units, and using period-correct bias ply tires. They didn't want the cars to be better, they wanted them to be authentic. They wanted to feel what it was like to drive a car that wanted to kill them. Groups like the Southeast Gassers Association formed with a strict set of rules that would make a modern NHRA inspector faint. No modern electronics, no shift lights, no data loggers. You have to shift with a lever, not a button. If your car looks too modern, you can't race. They recreated the ecosystem of the 1960s, and guess what? The fans went crazy for it. People started packing the stands again, not to see who went the fastest, but to see who put on the best show, to see who could carry the front wheels the furthest, to hear the unique choppy idle of a mechanical fuel injection system that hasn't been used in professional racing for 40 years. And this is where it gets really interesting. This revival proves something profound about car culture. We don't just love speed. If we just loved speed, we'd all be watching electric cars hum down the track in silence. We love the struggle for speed. The gasser represents the struggle. It represents the fight between a mechanic and physics. It represents the idea that you can take a piece of junk, apply enough horsepower and ingenuity, and turn it into a legend.
Let's look at the financials for a second, because the irony is painful. Remember those gassers that were scrapped in 1973? The ones worth less than the metal they were stamped from? Today, a genuine competition pedigree 1941 Willys gasser, if you can find one, is a six-figure car. Easily. The Stone, Woods & Cook Swindler II? If that car came up for auction today, we are talking millions. The market has realized that these weren't just old race cars. They were folk art. They were the physical manifestation of American hot rod culture at its absolute peak. Collectors are now paying more for the obsolete technology than they pay for cutting-edge supercars. But the legacy goes deeper than just auction prices. The spirit of the gasser, that run-what-you-brung, high-horsepower door-slammer attitude, is actually the grandfather of the most popular class in drag racing today, Pro Mod. Think about it. Pro Mods are suspended bodies, massive engines, blowers sticking out of the hood, and they are violent to watch. They are the spiritual successors to the gasser. While the NHRA killed the specific gas class, the DNA of the gasser, the idea of a full-bodied car with too much power, survived and mutated into the fastest door cars on the planet. So the gasser didn't really die, it just went underground. It waited for the world to get boring enough to need it again. It waited for us to get tired of traction control and paddle shifters. It waited for us to remember that racing is supposed to be scary. Now, as we head toward the finish line, there is one final piece of the puzzle. We've talked about the tech, the history, and the money, but we haven't talked about the most important factor of all. The one thing that truly separates the gasser era from everything that came after it. It's not the cars, it's the mindset. Because in 1965, nobody knew what the limit was. Today, we know the limits. We have simulations. Back then, the only way to find the limit was to cross it and see if you survived. Here's the thing about limits. They are invisible until you hit them. In the gasser era, the limit wasn't a line on a graph or a number on a computer screen. It was the point where the front wheels lifted so high you lost sight of the track, or the point where the transmission exploded and sent shrapnel through the floorboards. These guys were explorers in the land of mechanical violence, mapping the edges of what was possible with steel and gasoline. They were operating in a time before wind tunnels dictated the shape of every fender, before data acquisition systems told you exactly where you were losing a tenth of a second. They had to feel it. And that reliance on human intuition over computer precision is exactly why this era feels so special to us now. Think about the modern racing landscape. In Formula One, NASCAR, or even modern NHRA, the driver is a pilot. They are highly skilled, incredibly fit, and trained from birth to operate a machine that costs millions of dollars. But in the gasser era, the driver was often the mechanic, the fabricator, the tow truck driver, and the team owner all rolled into one. They had grease under their fingernails when they pulled up to the starting line. If the car broke, they didn't radio the pits. They got out and fixed it. That connection, that total ownership of the victory and the failure created a level of authenticity that money simply cannot buy. It's the difference between buying a frozen pizza and making one from scratch. One is efficient and consistent. The other has soul, even if the crust is a little burnt. And this brings us to the ultimate realization, the uncomfortable truth about why the gasser had to die. It wasn't just the rules, and it wasn't just the funny cars. The gasser had to die because it was a bridge. It was the necessary, chaotic, dangerous transition between the hot rod and the race car. Before the gasser, drag racing was largely amateur street cars. After the gasser, it was professional, purpose-built chassis engineering. The gasser was that awkward, rebellious teenage phase where the sport was figuring out what it wanted to be. It had the body of a streetcar, but the heart of a dragster. It was trying to be two things at once, and for a glorious decade, it succeeded. But physics and economics eventually demand specialization. You can't be half street, half race forever. You have to choose. And the sport chose the funny car because it was the logical evolution. It was the adult decision.
But look, logic is boring. Logic doesn't make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Logic doesn't make you scream at the top of your lungs when a 1941 Willys pulls a wheel stand that lasts for an eighth of a mile. We don't love the gasser because it was the most efficient way to get down the track. We love it because it was the most dramatic. We love it because it was flawed. In a world that is increasingly optimized, sanitized, and automated, the gasser stands as a monument to human stubbornness. It is a reminder that there was a time when the answer to how do we go faster wasn't better aerodynamics, but more power and a higher front end. It was a brute force solution to a complex problem, and there is something undeniably American about that. Now, you might be thinking, is the gasser era truly gone? In the literal sense, yes, you will never again see a major professional racing series headlined by straight-axle, high-riding coupes. That genie is back in the bottle. But in the spiritual sense, the gasser is more alive than ever. Every time a kid buys a cheap V8 and decides to slap a turbo on it in his driveway, knowing full well it might blow up, he is channeling the spirit of the gasser. Every time someone builds a car that scares them a little bit, they are tapping into that same vein of adrenaline. The technology changes, the cars change, but the desire to build something wild, something that defies common sense, that never goes away. So when we ask what killed the gasser, the answer is everything. It was killed by the funny car's efficiency. It was killed by the NHRA safety mandates. It was killed by the insurance companies. It was killed by the laws of aerodynamics. But most of all, it was killed by progress. It was a victim of the very speed it helped create. The gasser was the booster rocket that launched drag racing into the stratosphere. And like any booster rocket, it had to fall away once the payload reached orbit. It served its purpose. It took us from the street to the strip, from the garage to the grandstands. It taught us about weight transfer. It taught us about tire technology. And it taught us that a car doesn't have to make sense to be legendary. This is where it gets really interesting for us as enthusiasts today. We have a responsibility. These cars are getting older. The people who built them are leaving us. The memories of Lion's drag strip and the gasser wars are fading into black and white history. It is up to us to keep the stories alive. Not just the stats, not just the ETs and the trap speeds, but the stories of the people. The stories of the late nights, the empty bank accounts, the busted knuckles, and the sheer unadulterated joy of watching a 2-ton brick defy gravity. Because if we forget the gasser, we forget the heart of hot rodding. We forget that this whole hobby started with a simple, dangerous idea. I bet I can make this faster than that. So, the next time you see a picture of a 41 Willys with its nose in the air, don't just see an old race car. See a time machine. See a symbol of a time when the rule book was thin, the bravery was thick, and the cars were absolutely, magnificently insane. It was a time that can never happen again. But man, aren't you glad it happened at all? The gasser era may be dead, buried by the relentless march of technology, but its ghost still haunts every drag strip in America. You can hear it in the idle of a big block. You can smell it in the tire smoke. And if you close your eyes and listen closely, you can still hear the whine of a 671 blower screaming down the quarter mile, refusing to go quietly into the night. This has been a deep dive into the rise and fall of the gasser, a subject that defines the very soul of legacy motoring. I hope this script gave you a new appreciation for those high-riding monsters and the madman who piloted them. If you learned something new, or if you just enjoyed the ride back to 1965, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. It tells YouTube that people still care about real automotive history. Drop a comment below and tell me, if you could build a gasser today, what body would you use? A Willys, a Tri-Five Chevy, or something weird like a Henry J? I read every comment and I want to know what you're thinking. Until next time, keep your wrenches turning, keep the rubber side down, and never apologize for building something a little bit crazy, because safe is boring, and we don't do boring here. Thanks for watching.